This is part 2 of the creation, recreation, big basics of biblical, Unitarian, dispensational theology. And we'll go from here, if my machine will just obey. There we go. So this is number 2. Verse 2 is more important than verse 1. And it's part 1 of this. I just said to everybody who showed up early that I got halfway through the verse this week and I had 56 slides moving, and I could not stuff 10 pounds into a 5-pound bag. So we're going to have a part 2 of this in June, the second Wednesday of the month in June. So those of you that were here 2 weeks ago when I started this thing, and I translated verse 1 as when God began to give shape to the heavens and the earth. And if you want a copy of that PowerPoint or audio, actually video too, it's in my Dropbox, and it's available. Just tell me if you want it. You can listen to it. It'll eventually get to the YouTube channel, but it's available if you want it directly. And but tonight is verse 2 is more important than verse 1. So we're into that. There we go. Okay. Studies in recreation, and the earth had become tohu vabohu. That's the somewhat enigmatic English and Hebrew of the first half of verse 2. And that's why I said I can only do half the verse tonight, because I was up to too many slides. Why verse 2 is more important than verse 1? Well, here it is. Because the earth is there. And it's a mess with lots of water, darkness, before the so-called days of creation that everybody seems to point to. Yeah, Bob, but is there a dragon there? No, there's no dragon. Oh, wait a minute. There is a dragon. He's just not in Genesis. He's elsewhere. Bob is nothing if not a dragon, we won't say slayer, but purveyor of dragon lore in the Bible, only because it's probably some of the verses that you've never heard before and that are critically important when you're understanding creation and recreation, because, and we'll get into this in part 3, not verse 2, but the part 3 of these series, where I say that Lucifer did not fall in the beginning, but there was a dragon there. And he shows up in Genesis. No, he doesn't show up in Genesis, does he, Bob? No, he shows up in a lot of the other creation records. And then he shows up again, yes, he does, in the book of Revelation, where he's a complete jerk, and God has to deal with him there again. We'll get into a little of that tonight, because the earth was a mess, and we'll learn how that was, how that happened. Yeah, there's a lot to know about dragons in the celestial sea, and sea serpents or dragons in the Bible. Yes, you should be interested in that. I will pepper this particular session with, little bits of it, because verse 2 is a result of a cosmic battle between God and a monster of biblical proportions named Leviathan or Rahab. Tanin is the Hebrew word for dragon, or the word dragon in English. And were any of the creatures in Genesis? No, but it doesn't mean they were not around. And some reason again. Okay, good. So I'm going to put this slide in here again. I put it in last session just so you know that these are some of the more seminal creation texts outside of Genesis 1, and they deal with the beginning. They deal with the foundations of the earth, stretching forth of the heavens, the deep, the waters, the great waters, heaven and earth, and the sea, Leviathan, Rahab, and dragons. And if you look at these just casually, you will see what I'm talking about. I want to review something here before we get into this verse too deeply. There's young earth creationism called YEC, okay? And I want to review these terms, and then the second one, number 2, is OEC, old earth creationism. These are two views of Genesis and the creation records. The one, young earth, a view that posits the earth and heavens, the whole ball of wax, has having been created 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, depending on your chronology within the scriptures and the Septuagint readings. This is the Henry Morris John Whitcomb School of Theology. He wrote a book called The Genesis Flood in 1961, which I read backwards and forwards a number of times. There are many other proponents that followed. Ken Ham on the internet, Kent Hovind, and the Ark Experience in Kentucky, and then the website Answers in Genesis. They're young earth creationists, okay? Now, then, as a young and naive Christian, I was part of number one for the longest time. Then I became a gapist. What that is the next one, OEC, a number of views that posit the earth, biblical views, folks, that the earth and the heavens were old, millions of years category, if you want, I don't care. The gap or ruin reconstruction theory says that there was a gap of time between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis 1. Then there's another theoretical household called the framework hypothesis that presents Genesis as symbolic rather than literal, and a staging of creation. If you want to read that stuff, it's kind of boring. Another one is the day-age theory, where the days portions of Genesis are long periods of time in the creation process. And then there are a bunch of Christians, that are theistic evolutions that, can also be put in here that God used evolution in his desire to create and make heaven and earth. So long before, we're going to go over to the gap, ruin reconstruction theory, because many of you are familiar with it. If you were in Power of Abundant Living, if you've read Bullinger, if you know Schofield, a lot of other people that believe in the gap theory. The strongest proponent of that is a gentleman named Arthur Custance, who died in 1970, wrote a book called Without Form and Void. You can get that on the internet. I'll give you that hyperlink later in the session. Long before the modern age of geology, early church writers had examined the biblical text and considered the idea of a gap, right? That there was an indeterminate period when the created world fell into chaos. And this, you can see that I took this from Wikipedia, just so you knew I wasn't something I pulled out of my ears. I should take that citation needed out. Such a scenario often connects with the idea of the angelic realm, that the angelic realm was originally entrusted with power over the earth, which power concluded with the betrayal of that trust when a number of angels followed Satan in rebellion against God. Papias of Hierapolis, 60 to 130 AD, wrote, quote, "To some of them, the angels, he gave dominion over the arrangement of the world, and he commissioned them to exercise their dominion as well, but it happened that their arrangement came to nothing." So, folks, this is kind of where the fall of Satan tied into Isaiah 14, Lucifer fell. That's where this came from Papias of Hierapolis. We'll get into that in session 3, the third part of, it's gotten into like 6 parts now, but 20th century Cardinal Jean Danielou explains, quote, "Andreas of Caesarea tells us that Papias taught that God had conferred on certain angels the task of administering the earth, and that they betrayed that trust. And in the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria, I think everybody knows Origen, 184 to 253 AD, taught in his homily on Genesis that there were 2 creations, one in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 1, 1 and 1, 2, and a time gap between the 2. And the first involved the spiritual realm, the second a physical realm. This is just conjecture, right? Although he was not exactly sure what the prior creation was. And then Jerome, St. Jerome, for those of you in the Roman Church, 347 to 420 AD, wrote that Origen taught that the world existed before our own, a world, and that another will exist thereafter, and so on in constant succession. Now, that, folks, is where you get the Bullinger idea of the first heaven and earth, a second heaven and earth, and then the third one at the end of time. And that we'll cover as well, not in this session, but I just wanted to show you where these ideas had their first origin, where they first popped up, okay? So here's some more where, pardon me, the Gap or Ruin Reconstruction, another set of early proponents. In the medieval period, this was apparently a familiar interpretation. Flemish Catholic writer Hugh of St. Victor, 1097 to 1141, wrote in a reference to Genesis 1 and 1 and 1:2, quote, "Perhaps enough has already been debated on these matters thus far. If we could add only, how long did the world remain in this disorder before the regular ordering of it was taken in hand? But how long it continued in this state of confusion, Scripture does not clearly show." And then in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas analyzed these verses in his Summa Theologica and wrote, quote, "It seems better to maintain the view that creation of the heavens and earth was prior to any of the days, literally before the days. That is, there was the first creation of the earth and then the enumerated days of creation." You can see where some of the more modern gap theory, ruin, reconstruction theories, upon what they were built, okay? And now the French Jesuit theologian, Denis Patu, if I can pronounce French, I'm not very good at that, 1583, 1652, referring to the time gap implied, see what he says here, implied between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, quote, "The question of how great an interval there was is not possible except by inspiration to obtain the knowledge of it." And then the Catholic philosopher Benedict Pereira, 1535, 1610, wrote, quote, "Even though before the last day the heavens and the elements were made subsequent to the substance there, nevertheless they were not perfected, completely furnished until the period of the 6 days. However long that darkest day of the world lasted, whether it lasted one or more than 1 day or less than 1 day is not clear to me or any other mortal, unless one is divinely made so." And then, of course, in Jewish writings here, Genesis Rabbah in 450, it should say AD, not AC, states, "Other worlds were created and destroyed before this present world was decided on as the permanent one." And then in Zohar, which is 13th century AD, it's funny, comments on Genesis 2:4, and he connects it with the Hebrew phrase tohu vabohu, which we'll get into tonight, without form and void, found in Genesis 1:2, stating, "And these are the generations of the destruction which is signified in verse 2 of chapter 1. The earth was tohu vabohu. These indeed are the worlds of which it is said that the blessed God created them, and then he destroyed them. And on that account, the earth was desolate and empty." So there, in a nutshell, you're getting kind of where the old gap theory got its legs, and phenomenal that it was picked up later, and really after dispensationalism had entered its phase, the dispensationalists picked up on it. G.H. Pember, he's got a book called Earth's Earliest Ages, still published, and it'll give you some of the early gap theory. English theologian, author, 1837, 1910. He affiliated with the Plymouth Brethren, and those guys are the ones where John Nelson Darby, started writing his theological works with that group, Plymouth Brethren, in the mid-1800s. And he was called the father of dispensationalism. And then the gap theory, which previously proposed by Thomas Chalmers earlier, like 1780, 1847. This theory, God originally created the universe due to a rebellion of some of the angels led by Lucifer, as I said, or Satan. The earth descended into chaos and life was destroyed. Pember's position was that the first chapter of Genesis gave an account of God restoring or recreating the world after the collapse of the original creation. And then 2, here, the idea gained widespread attention when a second creative act was discussed prominently in reference notes for Genesis in the very influential Schofield Reference Bible, of which many of you are familiar with. So that's kind of the history of the gap theory, and the proponents here, you know them well, C.I. Schofield and his Reference Bible, first published in 1901, but as I said in the previous slide, the notes came out in 1917. Bullinger's writings, Companion Bible, around 1909. Bernard Ram, he's a pretty famous theologian. His book is called The Christian View of Science and Scripture. Phineas Jennings Dake in his Bible had notes. And then you guys know, number 5 here is some of the very, very familiar people. Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart, Chuck Missler, VP, Donald Gray Barnhouse, Herbert W. Armstrong, Church of God person, and then Garner Ted Armstrong, I don't know whether this is son or follower, and many others. And then, as I said earlier in this session, Arthur Custance, in his book, 1970 book, Without Form and Void, produced the best and most thorough defense of the gap theory that we know of today in scholarship. As I said, the hyperlink is, if you want to write it down, it's called The Doorway Papers. If you Google Arthur Custance, you'll come up with it. You can download the Bible, the book Without Form and Void, and read it yourself if you're interested in the gap theory. Now, I am not a total proponent of this gap theory, and I think if you've stuck around me for any number of years, you know why. I was a gap theorist, old earth creationist. I had no Hebrew training at the time. This is like in 1973, 74, when I first started studying Greek at Bible College, Gordon College. But I had no Hebrew. And it's a Hebrew text. So when I present my theories today, it's from an informed view of the original text, but not just English, but Hebrew, because I know Hebrew. That was my major in seminary. But it's not just the language. You got to go into grammar. You got to go into syntax. And I do see an abrupt break between 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. Young earth creationists only see a peaceful, placid scene in verse 2. And we're going to get to this, I promise. It'll be shown that this is not the case in the Hebrew text. But in Hebrew, as I've shown, the entire section, if you want to go back into session 1, the entire section of verses 1 through 3a is one sentence in Hebrew. Verse 2 is part of that sentence. It's a dependent clause. It's actually 3 dependent clauses, and it's dependent on verse 1. Actually, somewhat dependent on verse 3, but it's right smack in the middle. It's not a standalone action. That's why I'm not a gap theorist where, God created the heavens and earth in verse 1 and verse 2. It's a wreck. That's where God made heaven and earth too. That's really not, you can't prove that by the Hebrew. Here's a little tidbit for those of you who are interested. There in the Masoretic text, a disjunctive accent referred to as a rapia, indicating that the reader is supposed to pause before proceeding to the next thought, okay? Some think of this, that it indicates the and in most versions, but should be translated but or so or yet. We'll review that below. And yes, folks, those of you that know this, if you didn't, accents and vowels were not part of the original text. So that's interpretational, even though it's there in the Masoretic text. The Masoretes lived far after the 1st century AD. There is archaic markings in the Dead Sea Scroll, Hebrew and Aramaic, but they're not vowels or breathings or any of these other things that show up as part of the Masoretic text. That didn't happen until after the Christian scriptures. So I want to review this. I want you to keep this in your head that I taught when God began to give shape. It's the word create in all English versions, but it's give shape. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute. When then. Okay, when God began to give shape to the heavens and the earth, and when the earth at that time, or had become tohu vabohu, and when darkness was over the surface of the deep, and when God's Spirit was sweeping over the face of the water, then God said. The narrative begins with, let there be light, okay? If the earth exists in Genesis 1:2, and it does say it right there, and the earth was or became, they're both mentioned, right? Where does the light come from in verse 3? Job 26:13 tells us, I'll probably put this slide in every one of the presentations because people just don't know it. Light was not the sun, is what some people say, right? Because the sun isn't created until verse 14 of chapter 1 of Genesis. We'll cover this in the days section. But Job 26:13 says, by his Spirit, the heavens were made fair, cleared is the Hebrew. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Everybody says, what serpent? We're not there yet. Just keep this in the back of your mind. There will be session 3. Has to do with astral prophecy, meaning constellations. That's what the fleeing serpent was. And what does all that mean? You'll have to stay on the edge of your seats till we get to session 3. So back to this session 2, part 1. Here it is. That in the beginning, and I use KJV just because, you just need to start somewhere with some English version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness is upon the face of the deep. What's the deep? Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. What waters? Earth becomes the epicenter of God's concerns. But where did all this water come from? You'll have to wait till the next session to get deeply, no pun intended, into the waters. So we are going to go to the next. Oh, my goodness! Now I got my water moving. I didn't have my water moving. It's not a session if I don't have my water moving. So here we go. So excuse me. One more note about the beginning. I taught you a couple of weeks ago that the Hebrew word bara was not out of nothing, and I hope you guys didn't freak out because I gave you general comments that it was like form, make, that kind of thing. But there's an example right in the book of Genesis that will show you this, okay? Genesis 1:27, God created, bara, man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female, he created them, and everybody says, well, out of nothing. But Genesis 2:7 would contradict that. When the Lord formed man of what? Pre-existing conditions, the dust from the ground, and he breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. Man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden toward the east and the Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. So, in essence, and you can prove this by a number of word studies if you want to. Bara and yatsar are very common words. So is the verb asa, which also appears in Genesis. But bara is not out of nothing because Genesis 2:7 says it was formed out of the dust of the ground. You could, if you want to do a lengthy study and pull your hair out, just look at every usage of the word bara, yatsar, and we'll go here to, I think I've gotten to asa, right? The whole part of this is Genesis 1:26. God said, let us make man in our image. That's asa. According to our likeness, let him rule over the fish and blah, blah, blah. And then it says in 27 that he created him, bara. And then, of course, in Genesis 2:7, he says yatsar. So and of course, you see, you don't let it pass you that God said he's talking to somebody. Let us, meaning his counsel, make man in whose image? Our image. Okay, we won't get into that in these studies in Genesis. But I'm thinking the smart money's on the term bara, asa, and yatsar being synonymous, and it is. I've done the work. If you want to go back, it's not something for one of these sessions, but it is not out of nothing, never has been, never will be out of nothing, meaning create. Moderns think the word create is out of nothing. Ancient Near Eastern prophets who wrote the Bible did not think the way you think. So if you want to study the Bible, line yourself up with their thinking, not modern thinking. Young earth creationists demand that the word create in Genesis 1:1 is out of nothing. They can't make their case otherwise. And so you can see where that's going. So here's the verse, and we're going to get to half of it tonight. And the earth, it's already there, was or had become or became. We'll get into that. It was without form and void. Was it erect? Yes, it was. There was darkness. There was the deep. The Spirit of God moved. And then there were still those waters. A good student of Scripture needs to ask a few good questions. How can the earth be there in verse 2? Well, we haven't had the 6 days yet. Well, how can it be? What did I say here? I misspelled something. What does it mean to have, Tom Turner, you're just going to have to get this set of slides and help me here. What does it mean to have the earth without form and void? Why is there darkness? Why is there darkness? Well, it's because there wasn't any light. What is the deep? Really, what is the deep? You really have to go into these things because they're first mentioned. You crack your Bible. You open these up and, I know exactly what all this is. No, you don't. It's the first time it's ever been used. You have to have the rest of Scripture to look back on Genesis, and the prophets do over and over and over again, and they quote Genesis. You have to see what they thought it meant, because I don't care what you think it meant. I care what the prophets think it meant. What's a deep? How do I know that there was a sea serpent and there was a sea? Well, because it shows up in a lot of other contexts, especially Job 38. And I have avoided that. I haven't gone to Job 38 once in these two sessions yet. And where did all the water come from? I gave you the verse here, but I'm not going to get into it tonight. In number 5, it's Psalm 148, verses 4 through 7. Why is God's Spirit, or breath, as some want it, moving on a water's surface? And there's that silly water again. Here we go. Verse 2 is not chronologically set as a continuance of verse 1. Listen carefully. It's in the when section. When God began, and when and when the earth was tohu bohu, and when darkness. It's not chronologically as a continuance. It's part of the place setting of the whole sentence, okay? But I used to think that it was chronological when I was an old earth creationist. Verses 1 through 1-3a is one sentence, and verse 2 is in the middle. A group of 3 dependent clauses logically set within the sentence, not independent of that sentence. So let me give you, I'm going to give you a rough example. I think it was Chris Green who helped it. Bob, is it sort of like Once Upon a Time? Yes, it is. And I thought of a couple more. You're going to tell a joke. Well, a duck walks into a bar, and then comes the joke, right? Or it was a dark and stormy night, and then comes the novel. Seriously, folks, the last one is really kind of fun because Once Upon a Time it's not a fairy tale. A duck walks into the bar, it's not a joke. It was a dark and stormy night. Well, by God, yes, it was. But those are 3 modern analogous statements to, Genesis 1 through 3a, just because Bob's mind is crazy. And here it is again, because I want to put it in as many times as you can get it. When, then. That is the essence of those verses. It's all a stage setting, a place setting, a beginning before the real narrative, which begins, let there be light. So I'm going to quote Frankie. Again, my good friend Frankie Anderson, in classical prose, which this is, the expected translation of the earth became would use the vav or wav consecutive construction with the vayahe, the verb, in first position, making it an inventive clause. The use of the perfect verb, haya, we're going to get to that, in the second position has bewildered readers for ages. And I'll just say again, you'll hear me say it twice, that typical Hebrew begins with the verb. Verse 2 begins with a noun, the earth. And we'll see that. To be in coherence with the following two clauses in verse 2, the verb must have an aspect option of a Hebrew perfect verb portraying a present state that is a continuing outcome of a previous event. The earth had come to be in a state of whatever that word in Hebrew is. Verse 2 in the yellow there starts with a Vav disjunctive. The verbs and narratives are usually in first position. I give it to you again. So I do have to say I love the portraying a present state as a continuing outcome of a previous event. What event? We're going to get there. And here are the other translations which I approve. I like them. They're all consistent with the understanding that the verb haya, which, for lack of a better term, we'll say it is the word is. If you look it up in the lexicons, it lists to become or became or is. People will banty about, and I have myself said that Hebrew has no verb to be. But it has a way of stating that something is, was, has been. The Hebrew verbal system is complex. It is not simple, folks. It isn't that, there's no verb to be. Well, okay, Bob, prove it. I don't have time because you can't really prove it. There is a way to say all the things that we say in English, and we have funky words. We have the pluperfect, we have the past, we have the present, we have the imperative, we have the participial, we have as Greek has, we have mood, we have subjunctive mood, we don't have all the moods that Greek has, but you know that we wish, we hope, we want, we could, we should, we might. We have all that in English, and there is a way to do that in Hebrew. It's just complicated, and it's not fodder for one of these nights. But here's these three translations, which I love, and look at the dates, right? It's not like they were ancient. The one at the bottom, Robert Alter, I think he's got a 4-volume set of the translation of the Hebrew scriptures. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was, you see that? Then was. He puts it in the when category. It was welter and waste, whatever he meant by that, darkness, blah, blah, blah. And then a couple more. Moffat, the Moffat translation was up on this back in 1924. When God began to form, he used the word universe. He sort of got paraphrastic there. Heaven and earth is not the universe. It really means what it means. The world was void and vacant, darkness over the. And then the New Jewish Publication Society, when God began to create. And folks, Jewish, know Hebrew, they know Hebrew. There are already translations that indicate a scene the prophet looks at the earth and that the earth is already there before the days. In his mind, the prophet, before God's works of old, in Proverbs 8:22, in Anderson's very technical discussion in part 1 of these sessions, the first 2 verses are not God's actions, but a portrayal of the state of the earth before God begins to act. The narrative again, I'm saying it over. God said, then God said, then God said, after all the place setting. So, in the earth, oh my God, the earth is extant in the mind of the prophet. Well, what are the 6 days for? If you were to listen to modern young earth creationists, which, by the way, I gave you that book, the Genesis Record. It was about the late 1950s, early 1960s, where young earth creationists young earth creationism became the paragon of virtue. If you didn't believe that the 6 days were creation days, you were a heretic. And if you didn't think that the worldwide flood of Noah that totally wrecked the earth, and caused all the geological this and that, then you were just not with it. And, that's what the Genesis flood is all about. And it's really not a very good book. So in this session, okay, the Hebrew Oh, the Hebrew of it all. Here it is, the first, and the earth. It's red, right there, the big red. Vaha'aret. And it's the Hebrew narrative storytelling is unexpected because normally the blue that I've circled there, which is the verb haya in the form that it is, would be in first position. But here it's in the second position, and that's why Frankie Anderson says it's puzzled interpreters for ages. It is a verb disjunctive because the noun is first. And here's what, just various translations. Now the earth, when the earth, and the earth. Very respected translations. Formless and empty, darkness, and so forth. But in various ways of translating that conjunctive thing that's before the earth. So now, or as Anderson had it, when the earth was formless and void, and when darkness was upon, and when you had the ocean's depths shrouded with darkness, or the face of the deep and the spirit, and then when God's spirit is hovering, then God said. So the heavens are there too. Earth has become the focus of the place setting, right? It's there. You don't have to create it in 6 days. You can't create it in 6 days. You will find that out in session 4. In the introduction to my forthcoming book, you'll love this, The Beginning and End of the Cosmic Conflicts. This is it's in my introduction. The future of God's people is not a life up there in heaven, neither walking on streets of gold or playing harps while sitting in the clouds. How long would you want to play that harp anyway? Really? Life with God and his Son on a new earth is the order of some future day. As Jesus said, the meek shall inherit heaven. No, it doesn't. The meek shall inherit the earth. This is a truth set forth by the prophets from generations past, almost from the beginning of time, if I could say it that way. The earth was, is, and will be the epicenter of God's attention. Why, you ask, Bob? Why? Because God made humans his under rulers over the planet. And guess who was jealous about that? You got it. So you'll see this come up a number of times. I'm only going to use it here to show you what the earth meant to the Semites who wrote the Bible. The earth, the epicenter of God's attention, is right there in verse 2 that I mentioned that the earth was biblically flat. Yes, it is. And that Sheol existed under. We'll get into this in much more detail in session, 5, where I talk about constructs. I believe the Bible literally, maybe more literally than you do, and we'll get into that. But, there was the dome over the earth, which is called heaven. Well, we'll get to here. This is Tom Turner's favorite slide. And I've added a few things, Tom, so I've got to send this to you. This is I've given you verses that establishing literally, that this dome and the earth and the Sheol, Hades, and then Tartaros underneath is the underworld, and that the highest heaven is where God lives, and he's got a lightning bolt, and he'll slay you with it. The pillars of heaven are at the ends of the ark. The pillars of the earth are down below. And the one I love the most, Psalm 104:3 in the left top. Who lays, this is God, who lays the beams of his chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, walks on the wings of the wind. What waters? We're going to get there, folks. This slide will come up a few more times. So that's the earth. It's there already. But it was or became without form and void. What does all this mean? Well, here we go. The Hebrew of it all. Here is, was, became, or had become. The blue. The verb to be, if you want it, or become in second position is not typical, as I say. Why would someone want to translate it become? We'll get there. Because the first meaning in the lexicons, right, that says became, and of course the OEC's argument is that, it's the first listed meaning in the lexicons. That doesn't mean it's always that, just because it's the first one. I mean, you get. I was looking at some things today in Hebrew, and one of the verses, we won't get to it tonight. It says evil comes from the north. Well, it's the word, it's the typical word for evil, but it's not always the word for evil. It's the word calamity, or it's the word destruction. And that is going to come from the north in the future. So, you read these things and your mind goes, wait a minute, God is sending evil from the north? No, he's sending calamity, and there's a reason for that. But you can't just go to a lexicon and pull something out and say, well, that proves my point. You really have to know Hebrew, okay? So this is what Anderson said, to be in coherence with the following two clauses, meaning darkness on the face of the deep, Spirit of God moving in the face of the waters. The verb must have an aspect option of a Hebrew perfect verb portraying a present state that is in a continuing outcome of a previous event. What's the event? Oh, there's a dragon on the loose. The earth had come to be in a state of tohu vabohu. Yes, sharp thinkers, there was a previous event. Yes, we'll get into this right now. We're at was, okay? So we're going to look at, for those of you that maybe, not comfortable with the earth became or had become tohu vabohu, leave it was. I don't care. If you want it to be the verb was, which is a form of to be, right? As is became or had become, but it's one of the forms. It's in the second position. Scholars just have written till their ears pop. But see, the thing is this. Many begin with the premise that God infused the nearly 4,000-year-old text with modern space-time continuum. You can't do that. That's disingenuous on your part. God doesn't work things that he works with people. He doesn't force their stylus across the clay tablet and make them write something. That's not how inspiration and writing, scriptural writing works. Okay. It says he bears people along. If he was to stick in, the modern space-time continuum and the Hebrew's writing it is coming off his fingers, right? He's going, what the hell is this? They're not going to listen to that. And of course, he'd throw the clay tablet away. But he worked with what he had. God always works with what he had. Thank God, because if he worked with what we should be, he would give up. Some want this scene in verse 2 to be a very placid, watery stage where God is totally in control of his creation, and he is the only actor, and he's about to act and create everything, except it's not. And as I said, these are the few versions that I had gone. Look, these three very, prominent scholars like the word was, or Francis likes had become. But look at Homestead, who's the guy who I really respect a lot of his Hebrew. He's got a website, I think it's called Hebrew Poetry. You want to get your ears peeled back and try to make your way through his Hebrew. He's brilliant. He uses was, and so does Robert Altler. But look, it's when God began to create, the last one, when God began to create the heavens and the earth then was. That sort, you can see where it's going here. So, and Moffat was the earth being in the New Jerusalem publication. Hobbins at that time was. So if you want the verb was, fine. Leave it was, but understand it's within the first sentence and it's a stage setting. When, then. Note that all these translations indicate a scene when the prophet looks at the earth, which is already there before the days in his mind and before God's works of old, and it's there, okay? And here's the hyperlink if you want to write it down, or if you want the PDF later, you can get it, for Arthur Custance, who wrote the book Without Form and Void and has an entire, I think it's 20 pages, on the Hebrew verb haya and why he liked the translation had become, just like Francis Anderson. And it's the custance.org, and you'll get there. You can just make your way there. Entire book available. I've got it. It's fun. It's a good book. So the NIV I just want to give you a little bit of sense that the NIV translation in 1983, somebody was thinking the way I'm portraying. The scholars had a hard time putting have a hard time putting a new wine into old wineskins. It's a curse of translational work. Genesis 1 through 3a is one of the most sacred texts in the Bible. Touch it and you're a heretic. So they don't touch it. It's like you change John 3:16. No, everybody knows the first verse in the Bible. Just leave it alone, Bob. Or some of you highfalutin Hebrew, I almost said highfalutin Greeks, but highfalutin Hebrewists. So I just wanted to show you the 1983 NIV translation. It's a great translation, folks, okay? Here's what they said. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was, but there's a footnote, and the footnote says, possibly became. They're the only ones that had the intestinal fortitude. For you women, the only ones that had the ovaries. For you men, you know what I was going to say, the ovaries to show what I've been showing to you in a more Western, modern English translation. But somebody did do it. Not anymore. Go back to the NIV now. Someone had apoplexy and they took it out. So young earth creationists see Genesis 1 as peaceful. God is totally in the control. He's the Almighty, Bob. Don't you know? Pay no attention and don't even mention the darkness or those waters in verse 2. Just get to verse 3. Verse 2 is the canvas. The 6 days are God's painting. I've heard that over and over and over again in my nearly 50 years of study of the scriptures. You know, the first 20 were like never. He created everything out of nothing. I've already shown you that that's not possible to prove by the Hebrew. Even though there was an evening and morning on day one, there's no sun. Really, you ever think of a morning without the sun? No. Why is the word morning in there? Well, just think about it. Don't be stupid. Don't just let these I don't know what you would call them, almost like, what was it, snake oil salesman in the early West? Don't let them peel your ears back and say there was no sun. Day 2 is just as good as the other days. Well, we'll get there. Day 2 has nothing to say about it being good. There's no subdue the earth in verse 28. This is what young earth creationists gloss over some of these salient facts, but they don't want to be confused by the facts. So, without form and void, or waste and void, we'll be getting to this. Is like near the end of the session here, but it's critical that we get to this. What does this mean? Because young earth creationists don't want it to be a mess. They want it to be here it is, formless or empty at the bottom one. Or there's been a whole book written by a guy named Weston Woods called Unformed and Unfilled. They just want it to be, the canvas theory, okay? Here it is, the Hebrew of it all, tohu vabohu. What does it mean? Is it chaos or is it serene? Two sides of the story. God is in total control. Is the serene part? Well, no, there couldn't have been anybody trying to thwart God's works. My good, he's almighty. He controls everything. He knows everything. He is everything. He's everywhere. No, he's not. Verse 2 represents a placid ocean just waiting for God to act. And the other one, this is typical covenantal outlook in the Reformed tradition. Not one molecule can be out of place or God would not be God. That's just horse apples. You're not reading your Bible. God changes his mind all the time. He repents, he rejects, he listens to prayer, he changes. The other side, number 2, though not stated in the text per se, something occurred to bring the scene into a messy, watery state of being. Oh, and there's darkness at that watery mess, and God needs to fix the disorder. While not totally dispensational, the chaos Conf theory, something has happened to the creation already. Most proponents see God as changing his mind and fixing the mess. Here it is, the motif. You'll hear this in scholarly language, or you'll read it on the internet. Chaos Kampf, the German means Kampf, the struggle. Remember, Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, My Struggle. Kampf is struggle against chaos, is ubiquitous in myth and legend, depicting a battle of culture hero deity with a chaos monster, often in the shape of a serpent or dragon. Yes, and here's 4 of them. And I conveniently gave you my lovely picture by Gustave Doré in 1855. I really think this guy had a clue, because you can see it's a creation scene. There's 4 of them: the Sumerian story, the Babylonian creation epic, the Egyptian creation stories. There's not just one. That Egypt is hard. They jumped around a lot. Wherever the Pharaoh lived, the city that produced, certain works, changed the narrative just a little. But basically, and then the Greek traditions, where you all know, they're all basically the same. That there was an ultimate origin of the universe. There was water everywhere, and then there was this battle. We'll get into some of this when I do get into why Lucifer didn't fall in the beginning, but there was a dragon. And now we're into tohu vabohu. 19 places in the Hebrew scripture that utilize the term tohu. There's only 3 places where the word bohu is used: Genesis 1:2, Isaiah 34:11, and Jeremiah 23. Let's look at them, and we'll be done for tonight. Isaiah 34:1, draw near, O nations, to hear, and listen to the peoples. Let the earth and all that it contains hear, the world and all that springs from it. The Lord's indignation is against all the nations, his wrath against their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to slaughter. It's way at the bottom, and I didn't highlight it. Go way to the bottom of this sheet. It's basically a mess. Verse 8 in the middle. Sorry, before we go to the bottom. The Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. We're in the eschaton, folks. Isaiah 34 is a marvelous piece of eschatological. It's a basket full of eschatological information. But in verse, 11? The owl and the raven will dwell in it, this messed up place. He will stretch a line over it, the line of desolation and the plumb line of emptiness, the tohu and the babohu. It's a mess. Its nobles, there is one there whom they may proclaim king, and all its princes will be nothing. If you're a sharp reader of Scripture, you know that sounds like 1 Corinthians 2, where the rulers of this age come to nothing. So Isaiah 45, the context of the verses about Cyrus in chapter 45 of Isaiah, who God called his name hundreds of years before he was born. Here it is, for verse 45:18. For this is what Yahweh says, who created the heavens, and God who formed the earth, he made it, he established it. He did not create it a waste. He formed it to be inhabited. I am Yahweh, there's no other. Now, this is where most white ECs will take you. They believe that it could be a parallel rather than a chiastic form of the Hebrew, that Hebrew in poetry here. In other words, the first part, God did not create it a waste. The blue arrow, he formed it to be inhabited. It's just continuation rather than chiastic. He did not create it a waste place, and that he formed it to be inhabited as a brutal chiasm. And as I say, they want it to be equal. And so, and basically they put their pens down and say, well, God didn't create it that way. He formed it to be inhabited, and that's why the 6 days come up, and let's just go there. But no, let's go to Jeremiah 40, and this will prove and show it to you. The context, again, is eschatological, end times. Disaster upon disaster is proclaimed. The whole land is devastated. Yeah, suddenly my tents are devastated, my curtains in an instant. How long must I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? For my people are foolish, they know me not, they're stupid children, have no understanding. Oh, they're shrewd to do evil, but to do good I do not know. I looked on the earth, this is Jeremiah. He's been given a vision. He's looking at the end times, and he sees that it was formless and void. Tohu vabohu. Exactly the same phrase. And to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, behold, they were quaking. All the hills were moving to and fro. I looked, and behold, there was no man. All the birds of the heavens fled. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a wilderness. All the cities were pulled down. And because of God's fierce anger, the day of his wrath, destruction. For thus saith the Lord, the whole land will be a desolation. Does that sound like a peaceful white palette being ready to be written on by the Father? No. Yet I will not execute complete destruction for this earth, and shall mourn, and the heavens shall be dark, and blah, blah, blah. Here's what Bruce Waldeke, in a great article in 1975, said, look, scholars can see that the first day in Genesis has light. Jeremiah says no light. Second day, heaven. Jeremiah says the heavens fled. Third day, there was dry land in Genesis. Jeremiah 4:24 says the mountains trembled, and so forth. The most interesting and telling antithesis is how the day of rest, the Sabbath, is replaced by God's fierce anger. Waldeke suggests, listen to this, in almost unbearable words, Jeremiah sees the Creator undoing his work. Note that Buddha's Vermont, as Alana would say, the reversal of the cosmos back to chaos. And here I'm going to give you a couple charts there. Here in the PDF, I'm not going to go through them because here's Genesis and Jeremiah right next to each other. Tohu vabohu, exact phrase. All the stuff, light, heavens, dry land, luminaries, birds, main, Sabbath, and the reversal in Jeremiah. And it's a reversal that is destruction, folks. So you cannot get tohu vabohu to be a peaceful thing. And here it is again. A little bit more. And I gave you another source to read if you want, Bernard Anderson. So one more verse here. The earth shall not be moved, okay? For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and he is to be feared above all gods. Okay, there are other gods, folks. They just are. Quit arguing with the narrator, right? What's the first commandment? I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. There are other gods. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord has made heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and joy are in his place. Ascribe, which is the term in Hebrew to give or give it up, to the Lord. Ascribe, give to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Give to the Lord glory and strength. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. Let the heavens be glad, meaning people in heaven, and let the earth rejoice, meaning the people on earth, and let them say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Let the sea roar. We'll get into that. And all that fills it, because that means the people in the sea. Why was this? How could the sea roar? What sea? And all that fills it, let the field exalt, that's the earth, and everything in it. Then shall the trees of the forest sing for joy before God, before Yahweh, the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. It's eschatological. This is happening. The interesting thing here is that the earth, in the prophetic writings that we'll get into more and more, will be moved in the eschaton. But at the time of this, they are not moving. You can read it over and over again. The earth will not be moved. It will not be shaken. Well, there will be a whole lot of shaking going on in the eschaton. But the stability of the earth at the time of some of the prophetic writings is very, very important to the prophet. And the earth was tohu vabohu. It needed to be established. And that's what the 6 days do. They are the foundations of the earth. It's a mess in verse 2, and by the time we get to verse 31 or into chapter 2 basically of Genesis, God has used structural language. He's put pillars down. He's established the dome over the planet. He's put the celestial sea in its place. He's calmed it down. We'll get into the dragon, which he's confined in the celestial sea. But it's so important out of Genesis that the earth is established. The world is established. It'll never be moved. And so, folks, that's the end of tonight's presentation. This is next month, 2 weeks from now, where we'll get into the other big basics. And I will stop sharing here and we'll